And many people have dreams I've talked to have connections between the symbol of the moon and the symbol of the dragon. And they don't know why. You know? And then they read my material and go, my God, you just explained it, why I have those dreams. And the Native American Indians, the Zuni and the Hopi, call that barrier the Great Web in the Sky. Anybody ever familiar with that term that the Native American Indians use about a great web in the sky? That web in the sky is there. It's an etheric barrier put there about 50,000 years ago, but the original alien masters who came here didn't know that, right? They didn't know right away that this barrier was put there. They actually found out more in historical times. Because they've been moving us forward to get up to the point where they can rebuild the technology. And if you look at history properly from that just one agenda, ladies and gentlemen, you will find out that almost everything that has been happening from 11,000 years has been doing that. You don't need Gene Roddenberry or some mystic to tell you why is it. Everybody, even the countercultural pundits and thinkers and activists have been wondering why is it that our technological scientific ability is so much far in advance of our psychological, emotional and spiritual development. Because it's been pushed that way. That's why. Because some people are hell-bent on making it that way, who control the empires through the hierarchical system that Jordan Maxwell is the expert on, and other people have also right here in this conference today. You will hear people talking about this, going into these details. But you can put up many questions, but what's the answer? How did this all come about? Why is the eye at the top of the pyramid a reptilian eye? If you actually get a blow-up of the eye at the top of the pyramid of the dollar bill, it's not a human eye. Why are there 13 levels? You know, there's many, many things that a lot of people have not got into with this. Now, as I said, we don't have the time. Oh, yeah, and wait, and the Renaissance, which interestingly means rebirth, is a period where they were all patting themselves on the back. Yeah, lovely artwork and everything. Wonderful, right? But the Renaissance, what the occult agenda behind the Renaissance and the black nobility families of Italy was that this was the first time that they really were getting it together with the technology. It wasn't anything like what they needed, but it was like a first beginning. They were getting to the point where they realized it was recognizable, you know? And we call it the Renaissance, or they call it the Renaissance, the rebirth. Where finally some of the science and the scientists started to come together that was looking like it was the beginning, rudimentary beginnings of what they originally had before the technology was lost. Now, we, as I said, don't have time to go through all 11,000 years of what they've been doing. I have to leave that to your own research. But I can draw one picture for you about a specific time that happened in England in the 16th, the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century, but specifically the 17th century, at the time of the Tudor dynasty. A big agenda, an important thing we need to know about concerning this matter took place. And it has to do with this character on the right, who's known as Sir John Dee, and he worked for the British government. And interestingly enough, he was also ambassador to the court of King James, and he would go as an ambassador to Queen Elizabeth I. He would go to different countries. And when he wrote back to her, at the bottom of any intelligence documents he gave, he wrote his signature 007. Because John Dee is the head of MI5. British Secret Service comes from the Tudor dynasty of the 15th century. Ian Fleming, who wrote James Bond, was a member of the Secret Service, and when he retired, he thought, I want to write some books. Why don't I write about my own organization? So he did, and what you're reading there, and more importantly, the movies. Those James Bond movies, if you know how to watch those, they're telling you amazing stories. I mean, obviously, you've got to wade through all the phallocratic, macho nonsense, but if you can manage to sit through that stuff, you're going to see something fascinating in those stories. I love them. Notice MI5's logo. Look at the pyramid and the eye at the top. See that? Well, John Dee was a great occultist, sacred geometrist, and court astrologer to Queen Elizabeth, and black magician. And he worked for this woman, who is called Elizabeth Tudor, the daughter of Henry VIII. The original, she who must be obeyed. But her name in history is interesting, I would say. Right? She was known as the Virgin Queen, and it's not because she couldn't get a man. This is about something else. They've, told us lies in history, but Virgin Queen, remember how the offspring of one of the sides would procreate? Think about it. And John Dee was a Rosicrucian, which is a secret society of Freemasons operating in the world. And that is why in all government buildings, as Jordan Maxwell and people have pointed out, you have the Rose Garden and the symbol of the rose. In every capital city of the world, you have the Rose Garden, and the Bohemian Society and all these groups use the symbol of the rose, the Tudor rose. So John Dee was the man around the time when they actually discovered that there's a barrier up there, because by that time they had telescopes, and they maybe had some primitive flying ships. I mean, we've heard about the flying ships for thousands of years, right, and the stuff I've told you about already. But they may have made some primitive crafts and tried to leave the planet and couldn't do it. So it was around about that time, the 13th, 14th, 15th century, that these technocrats realized, hey, we got a serious problem here. We've just spent almost 11,000 years trying to build up the hardware to get out of this planet, and now, no matter what we build, we can't get out because there's a blinking Stargate up there. So they were in turmoil, and that is one of the reasons why those periods of history are so important, not for the reasons they've been telling you in history school. They really were in a dilemma. They were imprisoned in this planet. Remember in the book of Revelation it says, and God will chain the beast to the pit for 1,000 years? Right? Satan being chained to a pit. They realized they couldn't get out. So John Dee, to cut a long story short, said, well, we need another approach. We'll not stop with the development of the hardware. Keep that going, but we're going to need an altogether different approach. And he contacted his patrons, the Queen of England and her coterie, these original Illuminati types, and he said, what we need to do is go to a completely higher form of intelligence. Not extraterrestrial, but pan-dimensional. They may be able to help us with this. This is not the first time that such a portal has been opened on our Earth, and it wasn't the last. John Dee contacted some beings that C.S. Lewis refers to as the macrobes. He says that under our level of perception, we have the microbes. A couple of hundred years ago, if you had talked to anybody about microbes, microbial life, bacteria, they'd have laughed at you. They'd have thought you were insane and probably locked you up if you described that. Then we invented the telescope, and now it's common knowledge, right? A whole universe of life forms, right? Beneath our perception of vision. Well, C.S. Lewis says there is another level above us, on the next level up almost, which is the same. You can't have a physical instrument so much to deal with it. The instrument of noticing that and knowing that is the human intuition. Or shall we say the human imagination. But John Dee, being an occultist and a magician of very great power, opened a portal in England in the 14th century. The 15th century was opened in England. And he contacted beings of a higher grade of intelligence. This thing is a whole study in itself to do with occultism or what have you. And he contacted these macrobes, and these macrobes actually don't like being pestered by inferior types like him. And we can't say they're good or they're bad, you know, that those terms ain't going to work with this. But long story short, as his mind is nearly frazzling with their interaction, they actually did tell him, oh yeah, what's your problem? And they said, oh yeah, we have no problem with that, we can help you with that, we can, you know, fix that. And he goes, well then, let's do it. But the only trouble was that in order to do it, the information that they had to pour through his consciousness, he very quickly realized would take literally thousands of years to manifest in physical time. When the information started transmitting through his work, and his work was called Enochian magic, for those who happen to be into that, you know when you see all those lovely pictures and quaint images of magicians in circles and all these symbols around and the five-pointed pentagram and all that stuff, have you ever noticed how many of those symbols are actually planetary symbols for the start? I mean, we're talking occultism, yet they're mostly symbols of the planets. Because that also is a subject that's been put before us totally erroneously. I go into that in the book, but what that really is all about and why planetary symbols are used so often. So when he started translating into his Enochian, those quaint things you see in museums, all that information that was pouring down, it was too big for his consciousness and Edward Kelly and some other people that he worked with. So he had to get all his counterparts in Europe to get on the ball with this. So all these Illuminati families and black nobility intelligence people, you know, they were all working simultaneously at the same time. But then obviously history would notice this, wouldn't it? That all of these families start getting into what looks like the occult. So they sold that back to us as a period in history when suddenly there was a renaissance of esoteric knowledge in the world and everybody was into it. As if it's sort of something like a vogue thing, you know? And I'm not saying things like that don't happen. But all over the planet, all these rich families and rich people start getting into the occult. They've got to put it before us in this quaint way, just like they put swashbuckling movies of Errol Flynn in front of you, you know, to tell you something. The real story behind that is that these scholars were all working independently on this vast amount of knowledge which was pouring in day and night through the consciousness of the psychics of the world who worked for these royal families. Cornelius Agrippa and all of these other people were doing it, writing it down. And then later on it was discovered that it's so